When you think of the Roman Empire, what comes to mind? If you're like most people, you imagine legionnaires in Lorica Segmentata, gladiators fighting in the Colosseum, the classical pagan empire of Augustus and Trajan. Sure, that's part of Roman history, but this classical period only represents a small portion of Roman history. Contrary to popular belief, the Roman Empire survived the fall of its western half in 476. In fact, it continued uninterrupted for another 1,000 years. Taken as a whole, the Roman Empire was Christian much longer than it was pagan. Instead of evoking visions of the Pantheon and Hadrian, the Roman Empire should instead prompt us to imagine the Hagia Sophia and Saint Justinian. Based in the magnificent city of Constantinople, nearly 100 emperors came and went. Sadly, this Byzantine period is less appreciated than the aforementioned classical period. In this series, we will embark on a fascinating journey through Byzantine history, ranking each of the emperors from Constantine I to Constantine XI from an Orthodox Christian perspective. Let's dive in. Welcome back to my series on the East Roman Emperors. In part 1, we reviewed the Constantinian and Valentinianic dynasties. In this video, I'll be ranking the emperors of the Theodosian and Leonid dynasties. Let's begin with Theodosius I. As we saw in the last video, Valens was killed at the Battle of Adrianople in 378. It was the worst Roman military defeat in living memory. The eastern field armies were obliterated, and the Goths had free rein to ravage the Balkans. To deal with this catastrophe, Gratian appointed Theodosius as Eastern Emperor in 379. Theodosius established a base at Thessalonica and began mustering a new army. In spring of 380, the emperor marched out against the Goths. He was defeated but not utterly destroyed. Theodosius retreated and called for aid from Gratian, who sent 2 generals, Bauto and Arbogast, to the east. In the meantime, Theodosius dealt with church matters. The Council of Nicaea had failed to completely root out Arianism, which was especially strong in the East. Theodosius was a powerful opponent of Arianism. In 380, he issued the Edict of Thessalonica, which called the heretics demented and insane. Furthermore, it boldly declared that only Orthodox Christians could have their gatherings recognized as churches. This was a major step in the Christianization of the Roman Empire. In November of 380, he moved to Constantinople and made a triumphal entrance. He deposed the Arian Archbishop of Constantinople and replaced him with Saint Gregory the Theologian. In 381, he called the Council of Constantinople, which we know as the Second Ecumenical Council. After the council, Theodosius gave all the bishops of the empire a chance to accept the creed and deposed anyone who dissented. Although he barely participated in the Gothic War, Theodosius concluded a peace with them in 382. And allowed them to remain in Thrace. Technically, the Goths had surrendered, but they weren't decisively defeated, so these were generous peace terms. This peace settlement was very unpopular, as Theodosius had promised a victory, but delivered an accommodation. In 383, the Western Emperor Gratian was overthrown and murdered by a usurper, Magnus Maximus. Maximus sought recognition from the other 2 emperors, Theodosius and Valentinian II. Valentinian II was Gratian's younger brother, only about 13 years old at the time. With Gratian dead, Valentinian became the only legitimate emperor of the West. Due to his age, the young emperor was controlled by a powerful regency at his court in Milan. Milan refused to recognize the usurper, but there wasn't much they could do about it. Theodosius did not approve either, but likewise, there wasn't much he could do, so for a time he gave no answer. None of the emperors were capable of mounting a full empire-wide civil war, so a stalemate set in. Eventually, Theodosius assented to this new state of affairs, but everything changed in 387 when Maximus declared war on Valentinian and invaded Italy. Valentinian fled to the east and requested help. Theodosius chose to side with him against the usurper. In 388, he invaded Italy, where Maximus was defeated and executed. Valentinian II was sent to Gaul, where he nominally remained a junior emperor. In reality, he had little de facto power, as he was under the supervision of the general Arbogast. Therefore, for all intents and purposes, Theodosius was now the de facto sole Roman emperor. He stayed in Milan from 388 to 391, where St. Ambrose had significant influence. Meanwhile, there was some civic unrest in Thessalonica. In 390, the people of Thessalonica lynched the local general Butheric after he had arrested a popular homosexual charioteer. The army overreacted by killing thousands of people. It's unclear how complicit Theodosius was in this crime, but the story goes that he personally ordered the massacre in a fit of rage. Famously, Ambrose rebuked him for his sin and barred his entry into the church. After displaying profound repentance, Theodosius was readmitted to the church. He returned to Constantinople in 391. The city to which he returned was notably grander, thanks to the work of imperial architects. Constantinople began to ease into its rhythm of imperial and religious processions. In 391, the head of St. John the Baptist was taken to Constantinople. Theodosius piously wrapped the relic in his purple imperial robe and placed it in a magnificent church outside the city, a triumph in reverse. In 392, Valentinian II died under mysterious circumstances, and Arbogast appointed Eugenius as Western Emperor. Theodosius did not consent to this arrangement, intending instead for his son Honorius to take the Western throne, but he didn't make his intentions clear until 393. When word came that Theodosius had refused Eugenius, this of course ignited a civil war. Eugenius was a Christian, but he capitalized on pagan resentment. Among other things, he rebuilt temples, he canceled anti-pagan edicts, and he restored the altar of victory. Theodosius marched west with an army that was largely Gothic and barbarian. Alaric was one of his commanders. He defeated Eugenius at the Battle of the Frigidus in 394, aided by a miraculous strong wind. Once more, the armies of Christ triumphed over the banner of the old gods. During the course of the battle, Theodosius threw the barbarians into the front lines of the fighting. Unfortunately, this sowed resentment that would cause trouble later on. In 395, just a year after his great triumph, Theodosius died in Milan. He was the last emperor to govern both East and West. After his death, Arcadius, his oldest son, inherited the East, and Honorius, his youngest son, inherited the West. How should we rank Theodosius? Overall, he was a great emperor and a pious saint. He absolutely belongs in the S tier. As a side note, Theodosius's first wife was Aelia Flacula, who is also a saint of the church. She personally ministered to the sick in hospitals. I plan to do a deep dive video about Saint Theodosius in the near future, and when that's published, I'll leave the link here for you guys to check out. Arcadius. Arcadius was the eldest son of Theodosius I. In 383, his father made him a junior emperor, but he became sole emperor of the East after Theodosius died in 395. He was young, only 18 at the beginning of his reign. He was also a weak man, whose reign was dominated by a series of powerful ministers, beginning with the Praetorian prefect Rufinus. At this time, the Gothic general Alaric began wandering around the Balkans, plundering and raiding as he went. Western General Stilicho, who was the guardian of Western Emperor Honorius, came with a combined east-west army in an effort to defeat Alaric. But for whatever reason, no battle commenced, possibly because of divisions within the army, possibly because the eastern troops were called off by Rufinus, possibly due to fears of another Adrianople. When the eastern troops arrived at Constantinople in late 395, Rufinus was dismembered by some of the soldiers. The new power behind the throne was the eunuch Eutropius. He played matchmaker for Arcadius, pairing him with Aelia Eudoxia. He also picked St. John Chrysostom as Archbishop of Constantinople in 397. In 397 or 398, he campaigned against the Huns, who had invaded eastern Asia Minor, and he was Eastern Consul in 399. All of this was unprecedented for a eunuch, and it scandalized traditional Roman sensibilities. Meanwhile, Alaric continued to ravage Greece. In 397, Stilicho fought some inconclusive battles against him before returning to Italy. The Eastern court finally relented and gave Alaric formal command in Illyricum. This pacified him until 401, and it outraged the Romans. During this period, The eastern and western halves of the empire were still theoretically one state, but the courts of Constantinople and Milan were becoming increasingly more estranged. Previously, they were seen as the same empire, even when there were multiple emperors. But now, each half of the empire began to operate more or less as separate states. Stilicho and Eutropius hated each other. Eutropius persuaded the Eastern Senate to proclaim Stilicho a public enemy, and he tried to get North Africa to change its allegiance to the east. Both sides refused to recognize the other's consuls. In 399, the Gothic general Tribigild rebelled in Phrygia. Another Gothic Roman general named Gaius was sent to suppress the revolt. This backfired when the two joined forces and marched on Constantinople. Eutropius sought refuge in the Hagia Sophia, and Chrysostom used this as an opportunity to preach a sermon about the vanity of power. As a side note, although it shared the same name, this church is not the Hagia Sophia we think of today, built over a century later by St. Justinian. Eutropius was briefly exiled before being recalled again and executed. After Eutropius fell from power, the Gothic army briefly occupied Constantinople. Gaius demanded concessions and the building of an Arian church, but Chrysostom was uncompromising. It seems that Gaius aspired to a role like Stilicho had in the West, a Roman officer of barbarian origin who wielded supreme military authority and managed the affairs of state for a puppet emperor. In 400, the Gothic army began withdrawing some troops from the city, and they were attacked by the populace of Constantinople. Defeated by an army under the command of another Gothic Roman general, Gaius fled across the Danube and was killed by the Huns. Meanwhile, Alaric and his men moved on to Italy by 406. Over the course of the 5th century, the eastern armies gradually lost their barbarian generals, who clearly had dubious loyalty. The power in the eastern court was now mostly held by the political class, especially Arcadius's wife, Aelia Eudoxia. The empress quickly came into conflict with St. John Chrysostom. Allied with his enemies, she even had him exiled in 403 for his rebukes of her courtly excess. There was an earthquake the night of his arrest, which prompted Eudoxia to quickly bring him back from exile. Later on, Eudoxia had a statue of herself erected outside the Hagia Sophia. Chrysostom again rebuked her for her vanity, comparing her to Herodias. For this, he was deposed and exiled again, finally reposing in the Caucasus in 407. Eudoxia died in 404, and Arcadius came under control of the Praetorian prefect Anthemius. Arcadius died in 408 and was succeeded by his young son Theodosius II. The reign of Arcadius was chaotic. He was a weak emperor who was controlled by the oligarchs of his court. Eudoxia was a vain and scheming politician who exiled the saintly Archbishop of Constantinople. Still, in theology they were Orthodox, and among their children included Theodosius II, the next emperor and a saint, and Pulcheria, the future empress, wife of Marcian, and also a saint. How should we rank Arcadius? Personally, I'm not a fan of him, but I'll put him in the C tier. Theodosius II. Theodosius II was the only son of Arcadius and Eudoxia. He was made co-emperor in 402 at 9 months old and succeeded his father as emperor of the East after Arcadius died in 408. Since he was only 7 years old, he was mostly a non-entity. His first regent was the Praetorian prefect Anthemius. Anthemius was a capable statesman. In the West, Stilicho fell out of favor and was executed in 408. Alaric and his Goths were threatening Italy, trying in vain to extract concessions from the Western court. Frustrated at every turn, Alaric shocked the Roman world by sacking Rome in 410. Meanwhile, in the east, Anthemius was fortifying the cities and provinces. He constructed the famous Theodosian walls around Constantinople. Theodosius's older sister, St. Pulcheria, held a lot of influence at the court. In 413, when she was only 14 years old, she took a vow of virginity and persuaded her sisters to do so as well. It was said that the imperial palace resembled a monastery. Rumor had it that the emperor wore a hair shirt underneath his purple robes. Thus, the austere and ascetic court of Theodosius was a stark contrast in comparison to the decadence of the previous court. In 421, Theodosius married Aelia Eudokia, a beautiful and intelligent pagan girl who converted to Christianity and engaged in philanthropy. Like Theodosius and Pulcheria, Eudokia is also a canonized saint. In 438, the relics of St. John Chrysostom were translated to Constantinople. Theodosius II piously knelt before the relics and begged the saint's forgiveness on behalf of his parents. Thus, the story has a happy ending. John's remains were honorably placed in the Church of the Holy Apostles, the first non-royal to receive that honor. As a side note, it was during this period that the thrice holy hymn was revealed to the Church. Tradition has it that when St. Proclus was Patriarch of Constantinople and St. Theodosius was Emperor, the capital was racked by a terrible earthquake. The people began to pray for deliverance, and a small boy was miraculously lifted into the sky. When he came back down, he reported that he could hear the angels singing, "Holy God, Holy Mighty, Holy Immortal." This Trisagion hymn was inserted into the liturgy and is still used in the Orthodox Church today. In 420, many Persian Christians fled to the Roman Empire seeking refuge from persecution. When the Persians demanded their return, the emperor refused. This led to a brief and inconclusive war which lasted from 420 to 422. Taking advantage of this, the Huns raided Thrace. The general Procopius was sent to the east to negotiate peace with the Persians, and the Huns were paid off to leave imperial territory. Otherwise insignificant, the Persian War allowed two barbarian generals to distinguish themselves, Artabar and Ariobindus. In 423, Western Emperor Honorius died without an heir and without naming a successor. Joannes was placed on the throne, but the East considered him a usurper. An army was sent to depose Joannes in 425. In the fighting, Aspar, the son of Artabar, distinguished himself, and he would go on to have a long and significant career. They installed the young nephew of Honorius, Valentinian III, who had been living in exile in Constantinople with his mother Galla Placidia. Valentinian III would reign in the west from 425 to 455. The two halves of the empire were now even more divided. As the west continued to decline, they increasingly needed help from the east, and effectively became a client state of the Eastern Empire. In 429, Africa was invaded by the Vandals, and the East sent an army under Aspar, but to no avail. Also in 429, Theodosius began work on the Theodosian Code, a summary compilation of Roman law, which was completed in 438. As all of this was taking place, St. Cyril became the Patriarch of Alexandria in 412. Tensions were dangerously high between the Christians, heretics, pagans, and Jews. Unfortunately, there were some overzealous Christians who terrorized local religious minorities, culminating in the lynching of Hypatia in 415. Some exploited this tragic crime to falsely accuse St. Cyril of complicity, but it really wasn't his fault. In 428, Nestorius was made Archbishop of Constantinople. He espoused Nestorianism, the heresy that Christ's human nature is radically separate from his divine nature. Thus, he called Mary Christotokos, not Theotokos. To deal with this controversy, Theodosius II called the Council of Ephesus, which we know as the Third Ecumenical Council, in 431. By 439, a court eunuch by the name of Chrysaphius had gained ascendancy and somehow drove away Pulcheria and the Empress Eudokia. In the 440s, Attila the Hun raided the Balkans and even threatened Constantinople, but thankfully the Theodosian walls proved their worth. The Romans were humiliated, had to cede some territory, and pay massive amounts of tribute. By the end of his reign, the Monophysite controversy was heating up. In 449, Theodosius called another council at Ephesus, later known as the Robber Council, which affirmed the Monophysite heresy. As far as I'm concerned, this Second Council of Ephesus is the worst thing that came out of Theodosius's reign. He died in 450, 1 year before Chalcedon. Because one of his last acts was to call the Robber Synod, some allege that Theodosius II was a Monophysite. Interestingly, he is venerated by the Orthodox Church and by the non-Chalcedonian churches. So what's the truth here? Trusting in the Church, I'm convinced that St. Theodosius II was fully Orthodox, and that the Robber Council was the work of his treacherous advisor Chrysaphius. As it turns out, Chrysaphius was the godson of the heretic Eutyches. He used the Second Council of Ephesus to vindicate his godfather and condemn their shared enemy, St. Flavian, Archbishop of Constantinople. At the council, Flavian was unjustly condemned and beaten so terribly that he later died of his wounds. Therefore, I place the blame with Chrysafius and not the emperor. How should we rank Theodosius II? He seems to have reigned without ruling. Furthermore, the Western Roman Empire began to disintegrate under his watch. Having said that, he can be credited with some great accomplishments, including the Theodosian Code. If it wasn't for his great piety, he would be an average or a slightly better than average emperor. In spite of his imperfections as a ruler, Theodosius is a saint of the Church, so he belongs in the S tier. Marcian. Theodosius II died without an heir. The succession of Marcian was the work of three powerful courtiers, who formed an unlikely alliance: the Arian general Aspar, the pagan general Zeno, and the virgin princess Pulcheria. They agreed to have the eunuch Chrysafius killed and to appoint Marcian, a mid-level Thracian officer with no sons. Pulcheria agreed to marry him for the sake of dynastic continuity, but she would maintain her vow of virginity for the rest of her life. Almost immediately, Marcian and Pulcheria called the Council of Chalcedon, the Fourth Ecumenical Council, which condemned Monophysitism and reversed the Robber Synod. Marcian, like his wife, was a strong defender of orthodoxy. In the realm of international relations, Marcian boldly refused to pay further tribute to the Huns. This gamble paid off when Attila turned his attention to the west. When Attila invaded northern Italy in 452, Marcian sent an eastern army to help defend the west, and another army to attack Hunnic settlements across the Danube. Thanks to this pressure and some impressive diplomacy by Saint Pope Leo the Great, Attila retreated. The Scourge of God died in 453, and his empire began to disintegrate. Pulcheria died in 453, and Valentinian III died in 455. Taking advantage of the chaos, the Vandals sailed to Rome and sacked it in June of 455. A couple of years later, Marcian contracted a terrible illness, possibly gangrene. He got this illness after performing a long religious procession from the Great Palace to the Hebdomon, which he piously insisted on doing barefoot. The emperor died without an heir in 457. How should we rank Marcian? His reign was short, but he was a good and capable ruler. For his strong Orthodox faith, and especially for calling the Council of Chalcedon, the Church remembers him as a saint. Thus, Saint Marcian clearly belongs in the S tier. Leo I. Marcian had been the last of the Theodosian dynasty. When he died in 457, Aspar, who was very powerful in the court, chose Leo to be the next emperor. Leo was a Thracian officer. Like Marcian before him, he had no sons. Aspar almost certainly assumed Leo would be an easily controllable puppet emperor. In the end, he turned out to be dead wrong in that assumption. Leo's accession was the first to introduce explicitly Christian elements. His first test as emperor was to deal with unrest in the Church of Alexandria. Saint Proterius had been appointed by the Council of Chalcedon to replace the deposed heretic Dioscorus. But in 457, the Monophysites lynched him and elected a fanatical heretic in his place by the name of Timothy. Leo responded by issuing a referendum to all the bishops of the empire. Every metropolitan was to convene a local council to decide whether the Council of Chalcedon was valid and whether Timothy should stay or go. All synods except one decided to accept Chalcedon and reject Timothy, so Leo had him deposed. During Leo's reign, the empire repelled several barbarian invasions across the Danube. In the 460s, he began to distance himself from Aspar when it became clear that his son, Artaber, had a treasonous correspondence with Persia. He grew closer with an Isaurian officer named Tarasicodissa, the future emperor Zeno. Zeno even married Leo's daughter, Saint Ariadne, and they gave birth to a son, the future emperor Leo II. Leo also upgraded the palace guard with an elite unit, the Excubitors, among whom was the future emperor Justin I. By this time, the Western Empire was fast disintegrating. The fall of Carthage to the Vandals had been a devastating punch to the gut, as North Africa was the breadbasket of the West. In 468, Leo sent a massive fleet under his brother-in-law Basiliscus to help defeat the Vandals and retake North Africa. Unfortunately for the Romans, Basiliscus was totally incompetent, and his campaign was a disastrous failure. This defeat bankrupted the East and ensured the doom of the West 8 years later. The debacle of 468 allowed Aspar to recover a position of influence and drive Zeno away from the court. However, he crossed the line, persuading Leo to appoint his other son, Patricius, as Caesar. As he was an Arian, this was a very unpopular move with the staunchly Orthodox populace of the capital. In 471, Aspar, his son Artaber, and many of their followers were executed, ending the long Germanic influence over East Roman policy. The Gothic soldiers who had supported Aspar revolted and were put down by the executors. The survivors fled to Thrace and joined forces with Theodoric Strabo, who was awarded with a Roman military office to keep the peace. The problem was compounded by another Gothic army that arrived in 473 under King Theodomir and his son Theodoric. The court agreed to pay them an annual subsidy for peace, but the empire now faced the problem of two large warlike Gothic populations in close proximity. But these were problems that Leo would leave to his heir. In November of 473, Leo appointed his 6-year-old grandson Leo II, son of Zeno, as co-Augustus, thus making him heir apparent. Leo died shortly thereafter in January of 474. How should we rank Leo? He was a capable emperor. Among other things, he worked diligently to save the dying Western Empire, but sadly to no avail. His reign was not without failures, but it was mostly successful. He was a champion of orthodoxy, and for that, the Church remembers Leo as a saint. Therefore, he belongs in the S tier. Leo II. Leo II came to the throne as a child emperor, the grandson of Leo I and the son of Zeno. It was agreed that Zeno should be elevated to the imperial rank to oversee his young son. Leo II reigned for less than a year before he died in November of 474, leaving the throne to his father Zeno. How should Leo II be ranked? This is a tough one because he didn't reign long enough to qualify as a good emperor or a bad emperor. Since I have nowhere else to place him, I'll put him in the C column. Zeno. Zeno became sole emperor of the East after the death of his son Leo II. From the very start of his reign, he was widely hated for being an Isaurian. The first coup against him was led by the ambitious Basiliscus, the incompetent brother-in-law of Leo I, who had botched the campaign of 468. Being tipped off about the imminent coup, Zeno fled to Isauria with his wife, Saint Ariadne, and the imperial treasury in January of 475. Basiliscus. When Basiliscus was crowned emperor, the people of Constantinople massacred many Isaurians in the capital. They really hated Isaurians. Somehow, Basiliscus found a way to become even more hated. Being short on money, since Zeno had fled with the imperial treasury, the new emperor was forced to adopt conservative fiscal policies. This severely undermined his popularity. He also rolled back the Council of Chalcedon, which made him even more unpopular. The people of Constantinople totally rejected his heresy and began to side with Zeno. For the one and only time in his 33 years living on a pillar, St. Daniel the Stylite came down and hobbled into the Hagia Sophia just to confront the emperor, denouncing him as a second Diocletian. Even the emperor's sister backed Zeno, after Basiliscus executed her lover. Zeno successfully bribed the armies sent against him. In 476, he marched on Constantinople and took back the throne with no resistance. Basiliscus abdicated and took refuge in the Hagia Sophia. He was exiled to Cappadocia and later killed. Overall, Basiliscus was comically incompetent, not to mention heretical. That's why he gets an F ranking. Zeno regained his throne in 476, shortly before the Western Roman Empire fell. The last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by Odoacer on September 4th. Zeno could do little about this. He was still unpopular at home, and he had to deal with those two Gothic armies in Thrace. Regarding the Gothic problem, he was able to temporarily diffuse the situation. Although not as unpopular as Basiliscus had been, Zeno was still hated for being an Isaurian. Another coup came in 479, this time led by Marcianus. This attempt was nearly successful, but it failed. 2 years later, in 481, Strabo tried to take Constantinople, but he failed. He withdrew into Greece and died later that year. In 482, Theodoric the Amal raided the Balkans and acquired concessions from Zeno. In the midst of this chaos, Zeno issued the Henoticon in 482, a document which sought to compromise between the Chalcedonians and the non-Chalcedonians. However, this heretical formula didn't satisfy either side, and led directly to the Acacian Schism between Rome and Constantinople, which would last from 484 to 519. Zeno defeated a pair of would-be usurpers, Ilus and Leontius, in 484. Interestingly, Ilus was apparently sympathetic to the empire's pagans. Zeno's reign also saw a couple of revolts by the Samaritans, who had rioted and killed many Christians. Zeno's forces put down the rebellions and built a church to the Virgin Mary on Mount Gerizim, their holy mountain. From 486 to 487, Theodoric the Amal, later the Great, began to ravage the Balkans again. Zeno and Theodoric hatched a mutually beneficial plan whereby Theodoric would move to Italy, supplant Odoacer, and rule as de jure representative of the East. The plan would go on to be successful. Theodoric the Great killed Odoacer in 493 and reigned as de facto king of Italy until 526. Zeno died in 491 after 17 difficult years on the throne. How should we rank him? Despite all odds, Zeno managed to survive a turbulent reign, fend off several coups, and leave the empire in a stronger position than he found it. Unfortunately, his solution to the religious schism was an attempt at compromise that, in the long run, wouldn't fix the problem and only created more schisms. His legacy is forever tainted by the Henoticon. Thus, I will give Zeno a D ranking. As noted previously, Zeno's wife was the Empress Saint Ariadne, the daughter of Saint Leo I. It should be noted that she was Orthodox. Apparently, she did not support her husband's religious policy. Anastasius I. When Zeno died in 491, the people of Constantinople were gathered in the Hippodrome. There they were addressed by the Empress Ariadne, who was surrounded by the top magistrates and the Patriarch. The people demanded a Roman emperor, not an Isaurian, and one who was Orthodox. She chose a mid-level official named Anastasius, whom she later married. Anastasius was charismatic and competent, an older man with no children. Upon his accession, Anastasius solemnly promised the Patriarch that he would uphold the Orthodox faith. Unlike many of his predecessors, Anastasius ruled without handlers. Soon after coming to power, the new emperor pacified a rebellion in Isauria. From a fiscal standpoint, Anastasius was an excellent emperor. He wisely reformed the economy and tax regime. His responsible fiscal policy left a huge gold surplus in the imperial treasury, which made Justinian's reign possible. In 502, Persia declared war on the empire. The Persians had some initial successes, and the Romans put up a weak defense. But eventually, peace was secured, status quo antebellum. In response, Anastasius fortified the border cities, including Dara, later called Anastasiopolis, just across from Nisibis. His reign saw escalating internal conflicts between the Blues and the Greens, who were the two racing factions of the empire, and the Chalcedonians and the non-Chalcedonians. Anastasius was a compromiser who accepted the Henoticon. Worse than that, he actually seems to have leaned toward the Monophysite position. Anastasius brought Severus of Antioch, a heretical bishop, to the capital in 508, where he was kept at the court. Since the people of Constantinople were mostly Orthodox, this led to several violent riots. In 514, a general named Vitalian rebelled against Anastasius, championing orthodoxy against Monophysitism. Interestingly, he didn't proclaim himself emperor. Rather than supplant Anastasius, Vitalian seems to have merely fought on behalf of Chalcedon. Imperial forces were sent out against Vitalian, but they were repeatedly defeated. The emperor was forced to make concessions to the rebel. When Anastasius reneged on his promise to call a council, Vitalian marched on Constantinople in 515. The siege was a failure, and he was forced to retreat until the emperor's death. In 518, Anastasius died without an heir. How should we rank Anastasius? From a strictly materialistic point of view, he was enormously successful. Anastasius's reign was prosperous and relatively tranquil. His fiscal policy was a massive success. If not for his heresy, Anastasius would rank among the best emperors. This might be one of my most controversial rankings, but I'm going to put him in the C column. Fun fact, Anastasius made King Clovis I an honorary consul in 508. He had recently defeated the Visigoths in Gaul and converted to Nicene Orthodoxy. That concludes my video ranking the Roman emperors of the Theodosian and Leonid dynasties. How would you rank these emperors? Let me know in the comments below. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please drop a like and subscribe. And please share this video with anyone you know who might be interested in this content. With that, I'll see you guys next time.